Hi, and welcome to our lecture on the digestive system. We're going to be taking a look at the system that allows us to bring in food and break it down and ultimately absorb and use the nutrients. We're going to go ahead and break this into two parts. In the first part, we're going to be taking a look mostly at objects inside the head, but also some basic ideas of what is in the digestive tract and how we discuss it. In the second part, we'll take a look at everything that's going to be involved from the point of swallowing to the point of defecation. So let's go ahead and begin here with this idea that when we talk about the digestive system, we can talk about two different parts of this. There is a muscular tube going all the way from our mouth to our anus, commonly referred to as the alimentary canal, or the gastrointestinal tract, or sometimes simply as the digestive tract. Now, we also have organs that don't form the tube, but are really important for digestion and assist this. These are referred to as accessory organs. Primarily, we're going to think about these as glands, whether they be salivary glands, the liver, the pancreas, the gallbladder. These are things that are going to be adding something to that alimentary canal. And of course, when we think about digestion, we need to understand that it's both going to be mechanical and chemical in nature. So let's go ahead and talk about some basic terms we need to discuss digestion. We're going to begin with putting food into us, which is ingestion. And then we have to talk about the physical breakdown of large particles. This is best talked about as mechanical processing, although you may sometimes hear it referred to as mechanical digestion. Now, that physical breakdown is an interesting thing because obviously we can think about that as chewing, but it will continue in a couple of other areas, and we'll discuss terms for those. So if we think about this mechanical processing, we can break this down into chewing, which we refer to as mastication, stomach churning, that is kind of the use of multiple stomach layers to mix up food with stomach acids and enzymes, and we refer to that as maceration. And then there's also an intestinal churning process which helps to mix enzymes with the food within the intestines, and this is referred to as segmentation. And so we can take a brief look at segmentation over here just to get an idea that we're going to have two layers of smooth muscle in the intestine. We have this circular layer and this longitudinal layer on the outside, and we can essentially pinch our intestine up using those circular layers, and we can create wave-like movements with those longitudinal layers. Now, there's actually a couple of different things we can do by using these two layers together. In this case, it's really about breaking up and mixing food together, and of course with those secretions from some of those accessory organs. We also need to think about the fact that sometimes we actually want to move some things, and we have a couple of different terms for that. The technical term for the process of swallowing is deglutition. Now, you often won't use this term, but you might use this if you're actually studying the kinds of problems that someone is having with swallowing. In particular, we may have concerns about someone who's had a stroke, about whether they have use of all the muscles involved, and if they can't properly swallow, they may end up getting something, particularly liquids, down their trachea, and that's something we would worry about, so we'd actually want to kind of check and see if they can swallow properly. Now, the more common term that we're going to be using is peristalsis. This is propulsion of contents through coordinated contractions of both of those muscular layers, the circular and the longitudinal. And so you can get an idea that we have here a bolus, a swallowed object inside of a tube like this. And we can squeeze behind that using those circular layers. There can then be contractions of the longitudinal layers, and that's going to help us along with movement of where we are contracting that circular layer to propel an object in a particular direction. Now, this is obviously important if we're thinking about this involuntary swallowing process in the esophagus or movement of food through the small intestine, but we actually use this process elsewhere. We can move urine from our kidneys down to our bladder. We can, of course, urinate using this process along with the contraction of the bladder itself, and ejaculation in males would be basically entirely kind of this process. So if we think about movement of objects from one location to another, it might actually be helpful to be able to control that movement And we do have numerous valves, or what we refer to as sphincters, along the path of our alimentary canal. So these are thick rings in that circular layer of smooth muscle, usually something we can feel, like in the case of this pyloric sphincter, as being thicker than any surrounding muscle, and it can squeeze that little area off, in this case controlling the movement of food from the stomach down into the duodenum, the first or proximal section of the small intestine. We of course do have a slightly weaker valve up here, and we have other ones in our digestive tract. There's one between the small intestine and the large intestine, and then we have a couple of them at the end of our large intestine that help control defecation. Now, in addition to the mechanical digestion or mechanical processing of food, we also have what we sometimes simply refer to as digestion, or more kind of explicitly as chemical digestion, as the chemical and enzymatic breakdown of large molecules. And that can be a couple of different things. And so over here we see a couple of organs that are involved. The gallbladder here is simply going to store bile that is produced by the liver. You can see that there are ducts exiting from the liver and that they do go to and from that gallbladder. But you can introduce bile here into the small intestine. And then we have the pancreas, which produces digestive enzymes capable of digesting essentially anything that we can digest. Now that does, of course, exclude things that are indigestible to us, such as cellulose and chitin. But those enzymes can be put into the small intestine as well. Obviously, this duodenum is an important site for the chemical breakdown of our food, given that it has these two inputs in here. Now, the bile itself is going to be involved primarily in emulsification, which is going to help to allow the fats in there to mix up with water, and the pancreas is largely going to be involved in the secretion, the production of enzymes, which it sends through this large duct that it has here into that small intestine. So secretion is going to be the production of acids in areas like the stomach, and enzymes and buffers in areas like the pancreas, so that we can do this chemical digestion process. Now, of course, once we're done with all of this, we have the process of absorption. And we can kind of think about it in this way, that those food resources that we eat, that we bring into our body through ingestion, and that through deglutition we move down towards our stomach. And then through that mechanical processing, both in our mouth and in our stomach, as well as in our small intestine a little bit, we're going to be breaking this stuff down small enough that we can then break it down even more through chemical digestion. But the goal here is to get it into our body, which really means crossing the cells that line the intestine. That would be these cells here, bringing it into those cells, and then exporting it from there into the bloodstream. If we don't really get it into the bloodstream, it doesn't get to the cells of our body, and we can't utilize it. So absorption is incredibly important, and is really the step where those nutrients actually enter our body and are made available to us. So let's think about how our intestine is set up to be able to do this kind of thing. And here we can kind of see an example of small intestine. This particular section of small intestine has large plicae, which is the plural of plica, these folds that we see here, and it almost looks like a carpeting there because of all of the villi. We're actually going to have microvilli on all of our cells which line these villi. So we have a lot of things that are going to be increasing surface area, and this is all just part of the epithelial lining of this intestine, the area that's really involved in absorption. But we're going to have more layers, an area out here that is connective tissue that has vessels and glands in it, some muscular layers, and then another epithelial layer on the outside. So we're going to take a little bit closer look at that here and talk about the 4 histological layers of most of our digestive tract. So in this case, we're again looking at small intestine. We're going to start off here with a layer we call the mucosa. And you probably know why we would call the epithelial layer that faces the lumen or the cavity inside of our digestive tract as the mucosa. Of course, this in this case, in the stomach and in the intestines, is covered by an epithelial tissue that we know as a non-ciliated simple columnar epithelium. And of course, as a columnar epithelium, it's going to have goblet cells, which means it will produce mucus. But this will be our absorptive layer because of its microvilli. Deep to that is going to be a connective tissue layer, primarily areolar connective tissue, but you can see with large lymphatic vessels, with some capillaries, some glands, and even bigger vessels down here. That is our submucosa, named submucosa because it is obviously deep to the mucosa. A couple other layers are our muscularis externa, and we can see two layers of that, the circular layer and the longitudinal layer of smooth muscle, separated by a little bit of areolar connective tissue, and of course some nerves in there. And then our outer layer is kind of the confusing one. This particular one, telling me that this is either the jejunum or the ileum, is a serosa on the outside, which is a simple squamous epithelium. In other words, it is our visceral peritoneum. But if we were an organ that is retroperitoneal, that is behind the parietal peritoneum, which would be true of the duodenum, we would have instead an adventitia on the outside. Instead of having this simple squamous epithelium, it would simply be collagenous fibers. So it's all this collagen kind of in a looser wrapper rather than an actual epithelial wrapper that secretes serous fluid. Now let's speak a little bit about this peritoneum. We talked about this in Chapter 1 this semester. This is the double folds of parietal peritoneum that we want to take a look at here. And this, of course, is a simple squamous epithelium that may have some areolar connective tissue, maybe even some adipose tissue in it. You can see a little bit of adipose kind of within the folds in here. And we know that the peritoneum is the term for the serous membranes that are in the abdominal cavity. And they just do something weird that isn't happening anywhere else. They do line the body wall, so that would be our parietal peritoneum, but we can see the parietal peritoneum folding out and meeting to the visceral peritoneum that wraps around the organs out here. So we want to take a look at kind of some special terms to describe some of these areas of these double folds of parietal peritoneum. We have two what we call omenta, the lesser omentum and the greater omentum, and these are associated with the two curvatures of the stomach. So the superior curvature of the stomach is called the lesser curvature, and this little kind of fatty looking thing in here is the lesser omentum, connecting the underside of the liver to that superior portion of the stomach. Then we have the greater curvature of the stomach down here, and right under here is the transverse colon. This apron-like thing that looks like kind of some thin serous membrane in here with some adipose tissue that makes it look thicker in some areas, this is the greater omentum. The greater omentum is hanging from the greater curvature of the stomach. It connects it to the transverse colon. Those two things are actually really touching each other, but in order to do that, it actually flops down and then back up to connect the two of them, creating an apron. You could actually grab the bottom edge of this and pick it up and flip it up here so that you could see the small intestines underneath it. So the greater omentum is a really interesting structure. Now, as far as its functions, obviously it's just part of the serous membranes here, but it does have blood and lymphatic vessels in it, and it seems to have some function with the lymphatic system, being able to kind of cling to and compartmentalize maybe some infections in that area. We then have a couple of mesenteries that are going to connect our intestines back to that posterior body wall. So these folds of parietal peritoneum, the mesentery proper, which connects the loops of small intestine, and the mesocolon, which connects the large intestine, are going to hold those back to the posterior body wall. If we were to take a look in this area right here, which we refer to as the root of the mesentery, we would actually see the superior mesenteric artery come out through here, and these vessels out here are some of the branches of the superior mesenteric artery and superior mesenteric vein. Now, of course, within that mesocolon, we would find branches of the superior mesenteric artery and vein as well. And if we were to look over here on this side of the body, we can't see it because of those small intestines in the way. Some of that mesocolon would have branches of the inferior mesenteric artery. Now we can go ahead and move into the head region and start talking about the anatomy that's associated with the digestive system. And we're going to kind of spend a lot of time on the head because there's really a lot of stuff going on there. Obviously, this is the site of ingestion. Our mouth is responsible for that, and we have technical terms for many of the features we already know. Technical term for lips is labia. Technical terms for the gums would be the gingivae. Obviously, you've heard the term gingivitis, which is the inflammation of the gums. And then we have this tongue here. We've used a couple of terms for this in the past. Obviously, lingual and glosso can both refer to this. In this case, we have this little membrane down at the bottom. If you just lift up your tongue and kind of check out, there's a little kind of thin membrane underneath there called the lingual frenulum, which connects your tongue to the floor of the mouth. So interestingly enough, we actually have two other frenula. This one right here and this one right here, those are labial frenula, and they connect your lips to your gums. So a frenulum is just going to be this thin structure that connects one structure to another. Interesting thing about the lingual frenulum, it should help prevent you from swallowing your tongue, and you have a duct on either side of it from some of your salivary glands. Now, if we think about moving objects through our mouth, obviously we bring them into our mouth. We may involve our lips in that. We should, of course, chew with teeth, and we'll address teeth in a little bit. We're going to swallow the food back here by pushing it back with our tongue, and it needs to go through the fauces right here. This is going to take food back into our pharynx, and as we do that, we're going to pass this uvula. So the uvula is kind of the dangly doodad on the back of the soft palate, and it's kind of performing this function of preventing food from entering the pharynx prior to this act of swallowing. Then we'll move that stuff back into the pharynx. It has kind of another role, and we can think about that as the role of the whole soft palate, which dangles here off of the hard palate, obviously formed of the maxilla and palatine bones. This soft palate can flip up here and basically seal off this nasopharynx so that food can only go down and it shouldn't be able to go up. Now, of course, we know that this doesn't work under all circumstances. If you happen to laugh while swallowing something, particularly a liquid, you might end up blowing it out your nose, and you're probably going to regret that because the epithelial tissue in the nasopharynx and the nasal cavity is really meant only for air. It's not meant to protect you from things like soda, or heaven forbid you should accidentally laugh out some bourbon or something along those lines that might sting. So then we can jump into our salivary glands. We have 3 pairs of salivary glands associated with our head here, and they're relatively easy. We have a large parotid salivary gland. This is the one that was innervated by the glossopharyngeal nerve. It has a very large duct which comes across the masseter muscle here and enters the mouth near that mid-upper molar. You have 3 molars if you have your wisdom teeth. This would be the most posterior molar if you've had your wisdom teeth removed. And sometimes you can see a flap on the inside of your mouth if you look at your mouth in the mirror. As far as the other 2, they are both subs. One is sublingual, meaning it's underneath the tongue, and it has these little tiny ducts causing saliva to flood on either side of your tongue. And then there is the submandibular gland, which is going to be a little bit larger generally and kind of protrudes a little bit below the mandible here, and otherwise it's deep to the mandible towards the midline of the face. It has a large duct. This is the duct that is found on either side of the lingual frenulum, and this is the gland that you can potentially use for gleeking, that squirting of saliva out of your mouth in kind of 2 streams. All right, that does take us to teeth, commonly known to maybe dentists as denties, or dens being 1. You might remember the dens or odontoid process, which is going to be on C2, the axis, of course being named for being tooth-like. And of course we do go to a dentist, so dentis kind of makes sense as the root term for teeth. We don't tend to use that very often, however. Enamel is going to be the hardest substance in our body. It's the outside covering of this. Obviously, you know that sometimes in fires they might want to look at dental records or something like that to identify someone. That's because these things are going to tend to persist in conditions that would damage the rest of the body. Deep to that, we have a more bone-like substance. Bone obviously being hard, but not as hard as the enamel. This is the dentin, which forms a lot of the body of the tooth. You can kind of see the dentin goes all the way down here into the alveolar socket that the tooth sits in, whereas the enamel is up here only in this crown region, primarily above the gum line or just slightly down into the gum line. And then on the inside of this, we have the pulp cavity. Weirdly enough, the pulp cavity is filled with something called pulp, which of course is going to be blood vessels and nerves, and that obviously kind of is up here in this area, but also down in what we commonly refer to as the root. In fact, a root canal is this area in here, and so we can kind of imagine that if you had to have a procedure referred to as a root canal, it's because you've got some damage to this tooth, and you're going to have pain associated with some kind of damage happening to these nerves. So a couple other terms we need to talk about the tooth. The tooth socket is referred to as an alveolus. We actually can call those portions of the mandible and maxilla that have teeth the alveolar processes of each of those bones. And we can take a look here at the root as being this area here that is down in the alveolar socket. So we're thinking that kind of basically anything within the bony socket or even kind of below that gum line. The crown is the area that tends to stick up here above that socket. You can see we can potentially recognize a neck within the gum line. Obviously the thickness of the gums might depend on the health of the gums. So neck maybe doesn't come up quite as much as crown and root. We do have, of course, different types of teeth. That's one of the hallmarks of being a mammal, is having these different types of teeth, each of which performs a different kind of function. We have those chisel-shaped ones in the front of the mouth called incisors. By being a chisel shape, we mean that basically it's going to be broad across in one plane, but it actually comes to kind of a, not so much a point, but a sharp surface in another plane to allow these to kind of bite through objects. We then have canines, which will vary from person to person in how pointy they are. We don't generally call them cuspids. Canines tends to be the more common term, but we can call them cuspids for having a single cusp. We have bicuspids, which are going to be the ones behind those canines. They are going to be also referred to as our premolars. And then most posteriorly, we have the broadest teeth, the ones that tend to have multiple roots. These are the molars. And if you have 3 of these on one side, either upper or lower, that's because you have wisdom teeth. So these most posterior ones would be the wisdom teeth here. Now we'll take a look at those kind of a little bit more in context, at least once we get past taking a look at these deciduous teeth, the ones that we have in childhood and then shed and replace. So in an adult, we're going to expect to have 32 teeth if we have wisdom teeth, 28 without. Remembering that that most posterior set of molars would end up being the wisdom teeth, the ones that tend to come in pretty late, and that's of course why they're referred to as wisdom teeth. Not everybody will develop them, and some people will be able to fit them in their mouths while others will not. Now a complete deciduous set, or a set of baby teeth, is just 20 teeth, and we can see that here because we can just count them on one quadrant of this. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you can kind of basically see that this set here is sort of like a normal set for us, but missing our molars. It does have 2 molars here rather than premolars, but they're in the position where premolars would be in an adult. They of course have a canine and a couple of incisors in here. So just 20 teeth, which of course come in at a bunch of different times. If you're taking a look here, it'll give you some idea of when these things tend to come in, 7 to 9 months for the central incisors. I just want you to be aware that the actual variation in when these teeth might come in is even broader than indicated here. So maybe they will come in earlier than 7 months in some cases, or later than 9 months in other cases. Now here we can see adult teeth. Now we want to go ahead and take a look at these first. You've got incisors here, so the first 2 in one quadrant will be incisors. We then have a canine, 2 premolars or bicuspids, and you can kind of see that there are 2 separate cusps to these. And then we have our 3 molars here, indicating that there are wisdom teeth. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 in a quadrant. Obviously there are 4 quadrants because there are 2 sides in both upper and lower. And thankfully, in humans, it's the same in every quadrant. It's not always true. Sometimes upper and lower teeth can be different in some animals. But that means we have 8 times 4, which is 32 total, having the wisdom teeth. Our next task, though, is to talk about tooth surfaces. So we're going to begin here with a couple that are kind of difficult to illustrate, mesial and distal. And mesial, of course, sounds kind of like medial, and it does mean functionally the same thing, but we'd have to imagine this as the middle of the body. If I were to floss between these two incisors, I would actually be flossing that mesial surface of both of them, because it's facing towards the midline, which is defined by the position I'm marking here between those two incisors. Distal is a little bit more complicated. It's away from the midline. So if I were to floss in here between these two incisors, I would be flossing the mesial surface of this incisor right here, but it would be flossing on this incisor the distal surface, the one that's facing away from the midline. So everywhere else I'm flossing is going to be a mesial surface for one tooth, the one that is furthest from the midline, and the distal surface of the tooth that is closest to the midline. Then we have some other surfaces that get kind of complicated. We have the surface that faces towards the inside of the mouth. That's going to be either the palatal or lingual. So we're going to have palatal surfaces in here facing towards this hard palate, and then down here we're going to have lingual surfaces. Obviously it's the same surface, it's the one towards the inside of the mouth, but we're just identifying this based on the feature that it is facing. And we're going to do the same thing for the outer surface. So the outer surface can be buccal if we're in this area here where we're facing the cheek, but as we transition towards the front, we might refer to that as labial. Labial facing towards the lips. Now, we'll let you know that my dentist doesn't use the terms buccal and labial, but rather uses the combination term facial to refer to that outer surface of the tooth. Then we get to what might be the most important surface, the occlusal surface. And that's the surface that we see as we take a look here. So this is where the bite is going to take place as the teeth meet each other. And what's kind of really important about this occlusal surface is a couple of things. Number one, particularly back here on the molars and in our premolars, you can see that there's a lot of little pits in here for food to get stuck in. Therefore, it's pretty common to have cavities on the occlusal surfaces. Doesn't mean you can't get cavities on other surfaces. It just means that it's pretty likely that they're going to occur on the occlusal surfaces because that's where food can most easily get stuck. You can also see down here that we have potential for things like an underbite, or we have good occlusion here, or we have potential for an overbite. So occlusion is used for how our teeth actually end up fitting together. And of course, there can be multiple different ways in which our teeth don't occlude properly, so we don't get a good bite. You can see over here, if you take a look at this, that like with that overbite, you might appear to have a retracted chin or a more kind of protracted chin in the case of having an underbite. So we might actually be able to see that from your face, or it may simply manifest itself in the mouth. All right, now we just want to take a look at how we number teeth. When you go to the dentist or you have your dental hygienist cleaning your teeth, they may actually take some notes on your teeth, and they might want to refer to individual teeth if they're taking x-rays trying to figure out where you might have cavities. So we are looking at someone's mouth. This is our patient. Their mouth is obviously open really wide. It's kind of freaky here. But this would be the upper right back of their mouth. This, of course, being a wisdom tooth, would be tooth number 1. We have 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, and 16. 16 being still on the upper side, but this is going to be on the left-hand side. We then snake around. We don't return to the right side. We continue from the left. So the lower left back is number 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 31, and 32 is the lower right molar. Now, of course, if you are like me and you've had your wisdom teeth taken out, you don't have tooth number 1, 16, 17, or 32. So the first tooth that I would find in the upper right in the back would actually be number 2. Okay, but this is a handy mechanism where we can keep track of where you might have abrasions, precavities, cavities, or other things associated with particular teeth.